The evening shift at Kensington Palace always felt different after sunset. The grand halls grew quieter. Shadows stretched longer across the marble floors. But on that particular Tuesday in October, something felt wrong from the very beginning. Guard Thomas Bennet had been stationed at the East Wing entrance for nearly 7 years. He knew every sound the old building made. The creak of the third floorboard near the portrait gallery. The gentle hum of the heating system at 6:30. The distant echo of footsteps from the staff corridors. But tonight, there was something else. A silence that pressed against his ears like cotton. Thomas adjusted his stance, his polished boots clicking softly against the stone. Through the tall windows, he could see the last streaks of amber fading from the London sky. The grounds were peaceful. The protocol was clear. Everything should have been routine. Then he heard it. A small voice, barely louder than a whisper, coming from somewhere it shouldn't be. Before we continue with what happened next, if you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button. These real-life moments deserve to be shared, and you won't want to miss what happens. Thomas's training told him to stay at his post. The rules were absolute. Never abandon your position during a shift. Never enter the family wing without direct orders. Never, under any circumstances, break protocol. But that voice, it sounded young, confused, and it was coming from the restricted garden corridor. A passage that should have been locked and empty at this hour. He gripped his radio, thumb hovering over the call button. Standard procedure would be to report it. Let the senior officer make the decision. Cover himself with proper channels and paperwork. The voice came again, clearer this time. Hello, is someone there? Thomas's heart kicked against his ribs. He recognized that voice. Everyone who worked in the palace would. 5 years old. Curious about everything. Always asking questions that made the staff smile despite themselves, Prince. The child wasn't supposed to be anywhere near this wing. Not at this hour. Not alone. Thomas made his decision in a heartbeat. He stepped away from his post, moving quickly but quietly toward the corridor. His boots echoed too loudly in the empty hall. Each step felt like it was breaking a rule that had been carved in stone. The garden corridor was dimly lit. Just the emergency lighting casting weak pools of yellow on the floor. Autumn leaves had somehow blown inside, scattered across the tiles like forgotten confetti. And there, at the far end where the corridor split toward the old greenhouse, stood a small figure in pajamas, covered with tiny dinosaurs. Prince Louis was alone. His face was pale in the dim light. His small hands were clasped together in front of him, and even from a distance, Thomas could see the boy was shaking. "Your Royal Highness," Thomas called softly, keeping his voice calm even though his mind was racing. "Are you all right?" The boy turned quickly, relief flooding his features. But before he could answer, before Thomas could reach him, something happened that would change everything. The lights went out completely. Every single one. The emergency lighting, the hallway fixtures. Everything, the palace plunged into absolute darkness. And in that darkness, Thomas heard Prince Louis scream. Asterisk, asterisk. Thomas moved on pure instinct. His hand found the flashlight on his belt, thumbing the switch as he ran forward through the pitch-black corridor. The beam cut through the darkness, swinging wildly as his boots pounded against the floor. I'm coming. Stay where you are." His voice bounced off the stone walls, louder than he intended. The flashlight beam found Prince Louis pressed against the wall, his small body rigid with fear. Tears tracked down his cheeks, catching the light. His dinosaur pajamas seemed impossibly small, impossibly vulnerable in this vast, dark space. Thomas dropped to one knee beside him, keeping the flashlight pointed at the floor so it wouldn't blind the boy. Hey, you're safe. I'm right here. You're okay." Louis's breath came in short, sharp gasps. His eyes were wide, reflecting the dim glow. "The lights," he whispered. They all went away. No. It's just a power problem. Nothing to worry about." Thomas kept his voice steady, even though his own heart was hammering. Power outages didn't happen at Kensington Palace. Not like this. Not all at once. He pressed the button on his radio. Static crackled, then nothing. Dead. Thomas's stomach tightened. This wasn't right. None of this was right. Can we go back now? Louis asked, his voice small and hopeful. I want to find my mom. Thomas nodded quickly. Absolutely. Let's get you back to your family. Can you tell me how you got here? The boy wiped at his face with the back of his hand. I was looking for Paddington. My stuffed bear. I thought I left him in the reading room, but he wasn't there. And then I kept looking, and I got lost. And... His voice trailed off as a new sound reached them. Footsteps, fast and heavy, coming from somewhere deeper in the darkness. Multiple pairs of boots hitting the floor in urgent rhythm. Thomas stood immediately, positioning himself between Louis and the sound. His free hand went to his belt, fingers finding the emergency alarm that every guard carried. But without power, would it even work? Guard Bennett. A voice called out, sharp, authoritative. Is that you? Relief washed through Thomas. Senior Officer Matthews, sir. I have Prince Louis here. He's safe. 2 flashlight beams appeared, bobbing toward them. Senior Officer Matthews emerged from the darkness with another guard, both men breathing hard like they'd been running. Matthews's face was grim in the flashlight's glow. Thank God, we've been searching everywhere. He looked down at Louis, his expression softening slightly. Your Royal Highness, your mother is very worried about you. Louis straightened a little, trying to be brave, despite the tears still wet on his face. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to worry anyone. I know you didn't. Matthews turned to Thomas. Bennett, what happened? Why did you leave your post? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Thomas felt the weight of it, felt the other guard's eyes on him. Protocol existed for a reason. Abandoning your post, no matter the circumstances, was a serious breach. I heard His Royal Highness call out, sir. He was alone in a restricted area. I made the judgment call too. We'll discuss it later. Matthews cut him off, but his tone wasn't unkind. Right now, we need to move. The entire palace is dark. Generator backup failed. We're evacuating the family to the secure location until we know what's going on. The weight of those words settled over them. Secure location? That meant threat assessment. That meant something serious was happening. Is it? Thomas started, then stopped. Glancing down at Louis, he didn't want to frighten the child more than he already was. Matthews understood. We don't know yet, but we're not taking chances. He reached down, and in an unusual break from formality, scooped Prince Louis into his arms. The boy didn't protest, just wrapped his small arms around the officer's neck and buried his face against his shoulder. Bennett, you're with us, Matthews ordered. Stay close and keep that light steady. We're taking the service stairs. No elevators without power. They moved quickly through the dark palace, their flashlights creating small islands of light in the vast darkness. The service stairs were narrow and steep, meant for staff. Not for carrying frightened children through emergency evacuations. Thomas followed close behind, his light illuminating the steps ahead. He could hear Louis's quiet sniffles, see the small hand clutching Matthews's uniform, and in the back of his mind, a thought kept circling. A thought that wouldn't let go if he hadn't broken protocol. If he hadn't left his post, if he'd followed the rules and called it in, instead of acting on his own, how long would Prince Louis have been alone in that dark corridor before anyone found him? They reached the ground floor landing. Matthews paused, listening. In the distance, Thomas could hear voices. Organized movement. The sound of the palace security protocols kicking into action, but he could also hear something else. Something that made his blood run cold. Sirens. Outside the palace walls, multiple sirens, growing louder, asterisk, asterisk. The secure room was deep in the palace's oldest section. A windowless space with walls thick enough to withstand almost anything. Emergency lighting had kicked in here, battery-powered and harsh, casting everything in stark white light. Princess Catherine was already there when they arrived. She turned the instant the door opened, her face a careful mask of calm that cracked the moment she saw Louis in Matthews's arms. Sweetheart, crossed the room in 3 quick steps, taking her son from the officer. Louis clung to her immediately, his small body finally relaxing. "I'm sorry, Mummy. I was looking for Paddington, and I got lost. And she... It's all right. You're safe now. That's all that matters." She pressed her cheek against his hair, her eyes closing briefly. When they opened again, they found Thomas standing near the door. "You found him?" she asked quietly. Thomas nodded, standing at attention. "Yes, ma'am." In the garden corridor, he was frightened but unharmed. Something flickered across her face. Gratitude, maybe. Relief. But before she could respond, the door opened again, and Prince William strode in. Followed by 2 more security personnel and a man in civilian clothes Thomas didn't recognize. "Status?" William asked immediately, his voice tight with controlled tension. The civilians stepped forward. Thomas could see now he was wearing an identification badge. Security consultant. Probably MI5. Power outage appears to be localized to the palace and 3 surrounding blocks, the consultant reported. No signs of forced entry, no security breaches detected, but the timing is suspect. We're treating it as a potential coordinated event until proven otherwise. William's jaw tightened. He glanced at his wife and son, then back to the consultant. "How long until we have full power restored?" "Engineers are working on it. 20 minutes, maybe less. That's too long." William turned to Matthews. "I want a full sweep of the grounds. Every entry point checked. Every shadow cleared. Already underway, sir." Guard Bennett here found Prince Louis alone in the East Wing corridor. He'd wandered off looking for a toy. The room's attention shifted to Thomas. He felt the weight of it, felt himself being assessed. Catherine spoke again, her voice gentle but clear. "If you hadn't found him..." She didn't finish the sentence. "She didn't need to." Thomas swallowed. "I was just doing my job, ma'am." "You left your post," William said. It wasn't quite a question, but it wasn't quite a statement either. "Against protocol." "Yes, sir. I heard Prince Louis call out from an area that should have been secured and empty. I made the decision that his immediate safety took priority over position protocol." The silence that followed felt heavy. Thomas kept his eyes forward, his posture correct, even as his mind raced through the possible consequences. Disciplinary action, suspension, maybe worse. William studied him for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he nodded. "Good instincts." He turned to Matthews. "Make note of that in your report. Commendation for quick thinking under pressure." Thomas blinked, hardly believing what he'd heard. "Sir, You did the right thing, Bennett." William's voice was firm. "Rules exist to keep us safe. But rules that prevent us from protecting children when they're in danger are rules that need to be broken." Catherine smiled, small but genuine. Louis had lifted his head from her shoulder and was watching Thomas with wide, curious eyes. "Are you the one who found me?" the boy asked. Thomas nodded. "I am, Your Highness." "With the flashlight?" "Yes." Louis considered this seriously. "Thank you. I was really scared when the lights went away. But then you came, and you had the light, and you said I was okay. And you were right." Something in Thomas's chest tightened. This small boy, this child who would one day be part of history, was thanking him with such honest simplicity. "You're very welcome," Thomas managed. The door opened once more. An engineer stuck his head in, looking relieved. "Power's back up. Full systems online. Running diagnostics now, but everything looks stable." As if on cue, the overhead lights flickered, then blazed to life. Everyone blinked in the sudden brightness. The harsh emergency lighting shut off, replaced by the normal warm glow of the palace's regular fixtures. The tension in the room eased slightly. Not gone, but lessened. Like a held breath finally released. "Preliminary findings," the consultant said, checking his phone. "Looks like a transformer failure in the main grid. Not an attack. Just catastrophically bad timing and a cascade failure in the backup systems."
Oh.
William exhaled slowly. "So we went into full evacuation protocol over an electrical fault. Better safe than sorry, sir." Given the circumstances, the response was appropriate. Catherine stood, adjusting Louis in her arms. The boy was getting heavy, half asleep now that the crisis had passed and the adrenaline was fading. "Let's get you to bed, darling," she murmured. "Your proper bed this time. No more adventures." Louis yawned hugely. "Can Paddington be there when we get back?" "I still didn't find him." Catherine smiled. "I'm sure we can arrange that." She moved toward the door, then paused beside Thomas. "Thank you," she said again, quieter this time. "Truly." Thomas nodded, unable to find adequate words. The royal family left, escorted by most of the security team. Matthew stayed behind with Thomas, the two of them alone in the now empty, secure room. "Hell of a night," Matthews said finally. Thomas let out a shaky breath. "Yes, sir. You know you're going to be in the report? Breaking post protocol is serious, even with a good outcome." "I understand, sir." Matthews studied him. "But between you and me, you made the right call. Sometimes doing the right thing means breaking the rules. Just don't make a habit of it." Thomas smiled weakly. "No, sir, I won't." But later, as he returned to his post, as the palace settled back into its normal rhythm, Thomas couldn't shake a feeling that had lodged itself deep in his chest. Not regret exactly, but something close to it. 3 days passed. The official report came through. Thomas Bennett was formally noted for initiative and appropriate judgment in a crisis situation.
The commendation went into his file.
Senior Officer Matthews shook his hand. Everything should have felt like a victory. But Thomas couldn't sleep. He'd lie awake in his small flat near Hammersmith, staring at the ceiling, replaying that night over and over. The darkness, the small voice, the decision he'd made in a split second. What haunted him wasn't what had happened. It was what could have happened. Because the truth that sat in his stomach like a stone, was that he'd almost done nothing. He'd almost followed protocol. Almost stayed at his post. Almost called it in and waited for orders. For 3, maybe 4 seconds, his thumb had hovered over that radio button. 3 or 4 seconds where training and rules and fear of consequences had held him, frozen. If he'd hesitated just a little longer, if he'd been just a little more concerned about his career, his record, his own safety, if he'd been the guard who followed the rules to the letter, the way he'd been trained to do, Prince Louis would have been alone in that corridor when the power failed. A 5-year-old child. In complete darkness, in a locked section of the palace where no one was supposed to be, where no one would have thought to look first. Thomas rolled over, pressing his face into the pillow. The thoughts wouldn't stop coming. How long would it have taken them to find him? 10 minutes? 20 an hour? How terrified would that little boy have been, alone in the dark, while the palace went into emergency protocols and everyone assumed he was safely with his family? The what-ifs spiraled. They always did in the quiet hours before dawn. What if Louis had panicked and run, gotten more lost in the maze of corridors? What if he'd hurt himself in the darkness? What if the power outage had been an attack, something more sinister than a simple failure? What if Thomas knew he should feel proud? He'd done the right thing. He'd been commended, but pride felt hollow when all he could think about was how close he'd come to doing nothing. On the 4th morning, exhausted and worn down, Thomas requested a meeting with Matthews. They met in one of the palace's administrative offices, a quiet room overlooking the gardens. "You look terrible, Bennett," Matthews said, not unkindly. "Sleeping all right?" Thomas shook his head. "Not really, sir. The incident's still bothering you?" "I keep thinking." Thomas paused, trying to find the right words. "I keep thinking about how close I came to not acting, to following protocol instead of my instincts. And what would have happened if I had?" Matthews leaned back in his chair, studying him. "You're experiencing what we call post-incident processing. It's common after high-stress situations. You made a quick decision under pressure, and now your mind is working through all the alternatives. It's more than that, sir." Thomas looked down at his hands. "I almost didn't go. For a few seconds, I almost convinced myself to stay at my post. And that terrifies me. The fact that I hesitated at all. But you didn't stay. You acted. That's what matters, is it? Thomas met his eyes. Because what if next time I hesitate longer? What if next time I choose wrong? How do you live with that? Matthews was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than Thomas had ever heard it. You want to know a secret, Bennett? Every guard who's been in this job long enough has a moment like this. A moment where they realize how much weight they're actually carrying. How much responsibility sits on their shoulders every single day. He stood, moving to the window. Outside, gardeners were trimming hedges, completely unaware of the conversation happening above them. I've been doing this for 23 years, Matthews continued, and I still have nights where I can't sleep. Where I replay old decisions and wonder if I did enough. If I was fast enough, smart enough, careful enough. It never really goes away. How do you handle it? Matthews turned back to him. You accept that you're human. You did your best with the information and time you had. And you use these feelings, these doubts, to make you sharper, more aware, better at the job. Thomas nodded slowly, but the heaviness in his chest remained. There's something else, Matthews added. Something I wasn't supposed to tell you, but I think you need to hear it. He pulled out his phone, scrolled for a moment, then showed Thomas the screen. It was an email sent from Catherine's private secretary. The message was brief. Her Royal Highness wanted to personally thank Guard Bennett again. She asked me to convey that she's grateful not just for what he did, but for the kind way he spoke to Prince Louis, the boy has been drawing pictures of. The guard with the flashlight who made the dark not scary. She thought Mr. Bennett would like to know he made a difference. Thomas felt his throat tighten. He couldn't speak. Matthews pocketed his phone. You did make a difference, Bennett. You made the choice that mattered when it counted. Don't let the what-ifs poison that. But as Thomas left that office, as he returned to his duties, the words felt like comfort food that didn't quite fill the hunger, because he knew something Matthews didn't say. Something maybe Matthews didn't even realize. It wasn't the choice he'd made that haunted Thomas. It was how close he'd come to making the other choice. It was the knowledge that inside him, buried under the training and the instinct and the quick thinking, there had been a moment of doubt. A moment where he'd almost valued rules over a child's safety. Where he'd almost let fear of consequences override what he knew was right. He'd passed the test this time. But the test had revealed something about himself that he couldn't unsee. 2 weeks later, Thomas was back on the evening shift. The East Wing entrance. The same post where it had all begun. The palace had returned to normal. The power systems had been fully upgraded. New protocols had been written about child safety during emergencies. Everything had been analyzed, documented, and filed away. Life moved on. The world kept turning, but Thomas stood at his post differently now. His eyes scanned the corridors with sharper attention. His ears picked up every sound. His mind constantly ran through scenarios, possibilities. Threats both real and imagined. He'd become the guard who never quite relaxed, Matthews had noticed. You're going to burn out if you keep this up, he'd warned. You can't be at maximum alertness every second of every shift. But Thomas didn't know how to be any other way. Not anymore. Not after learning how much could go wrong in the space. Between following orders and trusting yourself, the evening stretched on, quiet, uneventful, the kind of shift that would have been boring before, but now felt like a gift. At 7:43 p.m., Thomas heard footsteps. Small footsteps, accompanied by an adult's heavier tread. He turned, hand instinctively moving to his radio. Prince Louis came around the corner, holding Princess Catherine's hand. The boy was wearing dinosaur pajamas again, though different ones this time. His hair was damped from a bath. He was clutching a well-worn stuffed bear under one arm. Paddington. Thomas assumed Catherine smiled when she saw him. Good evening, Guard Bennett. Thomas straightened. Good evening, ma'am. Your Royal Highness. Louis looked up at him with those wide, curious eyes. Then his face lit up with recognition. You're the flashlight guard. Despite everything, Thomas felt a smile tug at his mouth. I suppose I am. Louis wanted to walk this way, Catherine said, and there was something knowing in her tone. He insisted, actually. Said he wanted to see if you were here. Ah! I made you something. Mummy helped me with the hard parts. He let go of Catherine's hand and reached into his pajama pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. He walked over to Thomas and held it up. Thomas took it carefully, unfolding it with gentle hands. It was a drawing done in crayon, with the confident chaos of a 5-year-old artist. 2 stick figures stood in what was clearly meant to be a dark corridor. One figure was small, the other tall. The tall one held what looked like a bright yellow star. "That's you," Louis pointed at the tall figure. "And that's me. And that's your flashlight. But I made it a star because it looked like a star when you found me. Like it was glowing." Thomas stared at the drawing, at the careful way Louis had drawn a smile on the tall figure's face, at the small detail of tears on the smaller figure, and how the tears stopped where the yellow star's light touched them. "I love it," Thomas said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Thank you. I'll keep it somewhere safe," Louis beamed. "Mummy says you were brave? She says you helped me when I was scared." "You were brave too," Thomas told him. "You stayed calm. That was the smart thing to do." Catherine placed a hand on her son's shoulder. "We should let Guard Bennett get back to work, darling. But I'm glad you got to say thank you properly." Louis nodded, then surprised Thomas by stepping forward and wrapping his small arms around Thomas's leg in a quick hug. "Thank you for finding me," he whispered. Then he was gone, skipping back to his mother's side, ready to continue their evening walk. Catherine gave Thomas one more warm smile before they disappeared around the corner, their footsteps fading. Thomas looked down at the drawing in his hands. At the child's interpretation of that terrifying night, in Louis's version, there was no hesitation. No moment of doubt. Just a tall figure with a star appearing exactly when he was needed. That's who Louis thought he was. The guard who came without question. The one who brought light into darkness without a second's delay. But Thomas knew different. He knew about those 3 or 4 seconds. About the choice that had almost gone the other way. He carefully folded the drawing and put it in his pocket, right over his heart. He would keep it safe, like he'd promised. He would probably look at it every day for the rest of his life, and every time he did, he would remember. Not just the pride of what he'd done, but the shame of what he'd almost failed to do. Some people might call that humility. Some might call it wisdom, the kind that comes from brushing close to a terrible mistake. Some might even call it the mark of a good person. Someone who holds themselves to a higher standard than anyone else would. But for Thomas, standing alone at his post with a child's drawing pressed against his chest, it felt like carrying a secret weight. A reminder written in crayon and earnest gratitude. He'd been given a second chance to be the person people thought he was. The person Louis saw in that drawing, he just wished he could forget. How close he'd come to not being that person at all. The shift continued. The palace settled into its nighttime rhythms. Somewhere above him, a 5-year-old boy was probably being tucked into bed. Paddington clutched tight, safe and warm, and completely unaware of the complicated feelings his simple thank you had stirred. Thomas remained at his post, vigilant, watchful, carrying his commendation and his guilt in equal measure, and wondering if anyone else in the world understood what it felt like to be praised for. Something you almost didn't do. 6 months passed. Then a year. The incident became palace history, filed away with countless other moments that happened behind walls most people would never see. Thomas Bennett remained at Kensington Palace. He continued his shifts with the same careful attention, the same heightened awareness. The drawing Louis had made stayed in his wallet, creased from being carried everywhere. Sometimes, during quiet moments, he'd take it out and look at it. The stick figure with the star never changed. The smile never faded. The child's version of that night remained frozen in crayon, perfect and complete. But Thomas changed. Slowly, in ways he barely noticed at first. He became the guard other staff members came to when something seemed off. When a door was left open that should have been closed, when a sound didn't quite fit the pattern, he never dismissed their concerns, never told them they were overreacting, because he knew. He knew how easily things could go wrong. How quickly a routine evening could become a crisis. How much depended on people trusting their instincts instead of just following procedures. Matthews noticed. "You've become a better guard," he told Thomas one afternoon. "More thoughtful. You see things others miss." Thomas wanted to explain that seeing things others missed also meant seeing the things he'd almost missed. That every time he caught a potential problem early, he was haunted by the one he'd almost ignored. But he just nodded and said, "Thank you, sir." The truth was, Thomas had learned to live with his silent regret. Not to overcome it, not to let it go, but to carry it the way some people carry old scars. A permanent reminder of a wound that had healed but never quite disappeared. He never told anyone about those 3 or 4 seconds of hesitation. Not Matthews. Not the counselor the palace provided after the incident. Not his family or friends. It was his alone. A private measure of who he'd been in that crucial moment versus who everyone believed he was. Sometimes he wondered if that made him a fraud. If accepting praise for quick action, while knowing he'd hesitated, made him dishonest somehow. But then he'd remember Lewis's face in the darkness. The relief that had flooded through when the flashlight had found him. The small voice saying, "Thank you for finding me." He'd been there. However long it had taken him to decide, he'd been there when it mattered. That had to count for something. One spring evening, almost 18 months after that October night, Thomas was ending his shift when he saw Prince Louis again. The boy was older now, taller. 6 years old and walking with the kind of confidence that children develop when they feel safe in their world. He was with his siblings this time, being herded along by their nanny toward the family quarters. Louis caught sight of Thomas and waved enthusiastically. "That's the flashlight guard," he told his brother, pointing. Prince George looked over with polite interest, the kind of expression that suggested he'd heard this story many times. Princess Charlotte just smiled and waved too. The nanny nodded respectfully to Thomas as they passed. Louis looked back over his shoulder, still waving, till they turned the corner and disappeared. Thomas stood there for a moment, watching the empty corridor. The boy had moved on completely. That night was just a story to him now, an adventure that had turned out fine. He probably thought about it as often as he thought about any other childhood memory. Just to say, rarely, but for Thomas, it remained present. Every shift, every decision, every time he had to choose between protocol and instinct, he carried it with him like a stone in his pocket. Smooth from handling, familiar, heavy. Some might call that burden unnecessary. Some might say he was being too hard on himself, that he'd done nothing wrong and should let it go. Some might argue that the hesitation made his final choice even more meaningful. Proof that he'd overcome his fears and done the right thing despite them. But Thomas understood something. Those people didn't. He understood that sometimes the hardest part of being a hero isn't the heroic act itself. It's living with the knowledge of how close you came to not acting at all. He understood that you could be praised, commended, and thanked, and still know in your deepest heart that you almost failed. That the person everyone thinks you are and the person you know yourself to be might never fully align. That was his silent regret. Not what happened that evening, but what almost happened. The version of himself he'd met in those few seconds of hesitation. The version that had valued rules and safety and consequences over a child's frightened voice in the dark. He'd made the right choice. He would always be grateful for that. But he would never forget how easily it could have been the wrong one. As Thomas left the palace that evening, walking out into the London twilight, he passed a newspaper stand. The headline was about something political, something that would be forgotten in a week. Below it, barely visible, was a small photograph of the royal family at some official function. Louis was in it, smiling his gap-toothed smile, holding his father's hand. Safe, happy, growing up the way every child should. Thomas smiled too. Whatever weight he carried, whatever regret haunted his quiet moments, it was worth it for that. For knowing that boy was safe, that he'd been there when it mattered, even if he'd almost not been. He walked home through the crowded streets, anonymous in the evening rush. Just another guard finishing another shift. Just another person carrying the complicated truth of their own choices through the world and in his wallet. Pressed between cards and receipts and the mundane debris of daily life, a crayon drawing remained. A tall figure. A small figure. A star bringing light into darkness. The way it should have happened, the way it did happen. Even if not as quickly or confidently as everyone believed, the way Thomas Bennett would spend the rest of his life being grateful for, while never quite forgiving himself for the alternative he'd almost chosen instead. That was the story no one else would ever know. The silent regret of a good man who understood that doing the right thing didn't erase the moment when you'd almost done nothing at all, and maybe, in the end, that knowledge was what would keep him sharp, keep him ready, ensure that if that moment ever came again, the hesitation would be shorter, the choice clearer, the action faster. Maybe carrying that regret was the price of being someone who would always choose right when it mattered most, even if no one else would ever know how much that choice had cost him, even if the only witness was himself. Standing in a dark corridor, thumb hovering over a radio, caught forever in those 3 or 4 seconds that had changed everything and nothing at all.